In 2020, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or better known as the Mormons, announced that they would be building a new Mormon temple, their first on the Chinese mainland in the city of Shanghai. For anyone who knows anything about religious policy in mainland China, this was indeed shocking news. You see, the People's Republic of China has only 5 recognised religions: the Taoists, the Buddhists, Muslims, and Protestant and Catholic Christianity. If you are not an organisation officially associated with one of those official religions, then you are not allowed to build houses of worship on mainland China. And the Mormons are not one of those officially sanctioned groups. What this means, that if the Mormons are to build a temple in Shanghai, that China is on the verge of recognising a 6th official religion. And that religion is Mormonism. Now, as it turns out, it wasn't just me who was shocked by this news. The Chinese government was also shocked that there was about to become a Mormon temple in Shanghai. And the Shanghai government quickly clarified within a few days of the release of the news from Salt Lake City that the Mormon Church had become confused when it came to official communications, and that there were no plans for a Mormon temple to be built in Shanghai. But that the Mormons could become confused suggests that the Communist Party and the Mormon Church are communicating in the first place. So why is the largest Communist Party on earth communicating with one of America's fastest growing religious groups? Well, it turns out that the Mormon Church and the Chinese government have been engaged in a decades-long courting of each other. So successful has this courtship been that today the Communist Party of China has better relations with the Mormon Church than really any other religious organisation on earth. And indeed, the Mormons have better relations with the Chinese government than the US government does. So, how did the officially atheistical Communist Party and the very conservative and very American Mormon Church become best friends forever? Well, you're going to have to watch the rest of the video to find out. In 1852, the first Mormons would set foot on Chinese soil, and these early Mormon missionaries would hate every second of their life in China and leave after only 6 weeks. The 3 Mormons, James Lewis, Hosea Stout and Chapman Duncan, had been sent out by Brigham Young, the then leader of the LDS Church, as part of a global mission to try and attract as many converts to the new faith as possible. They had been sent out from Utah to the British colony of Hong Kong somewhat reluctantly. All of these men had families and careers in Utah and had completed an arduous trek to the Utah Territory only a couple of years prior. None of them, it seems, were particularly keen on setting out on another round-the-world trip. It should also be pointed out that this is at the very beginning of the Mormon tradition of the mission trip. In the decades and centuries to come, these trips would become a well-oiled machine. For example, I encountered a couple of Mormon missionaries a few years ago who had been gifted an iPad so as to help convert me to the faith. This was not successful, but, iPads are nice. Back in the 1850s, however, it was much more of a seat-of-the-pants affair, in which the Mormon missionaries were sent out with little more than the clothes on their back and a prayer. What this meant in practice is that our 3 Mormon missionaries were taking a trip across the Pacific and setting up the infrastructure of a Mormon mission in a brand new country entirely based on their own funds. So you can kind of understand why they were a little bit reluctant to go out on the trip. The first China mission of the LDS Church was, even by the admission of its participants, a complete and total failure. None of the men had ever been to Asia before. They knew little about Chinese culture and spoke none of the local languages and dialects. In other words, they had no way of communicating with or engaging with the local Chinese population. Now, while they could communicate with the very small white population that then lived in Hong Kong, these colonials had absolutely no interest in talking to the Mormons. You see, early Mormon converts tended to come from the lower rungs of society. The founder, Joseph Smith, had found initial success in upstate New York, an agrarian society that was quickly being left behind by early industrialisation. In Europe, a lot of the early Mormon missionaries would come from places like the Welsh Valleys. These are places where the malaise of early industrial capitalism were being felt most acutely, and where you could find people for whom the idea of abandoning their current society and joining a wacky new religious group in the Americas sounded most appealing. The white colonial society in Hong Kong do not fit this bill. It should also be stated that Hong Kong in this time was very racially segregated, but there was also a steep class barrier. White colonials looking out from the clubs that they tended to hang out in would have viewed the three Mormon missionaries as the kind of human driftwood that floated up on Hong Kong and other British imperial entrepôts from time to time. They were probably something best avoided. For their entire time in Hong Kong then, our three Mormon missionaries would be unable to enter Chinese society and live on the very fringes of the European one that they had found there. Not surprising then that our three Mormons not only attracted zero converts, they also seem to have attracted almost no interest in their new faith. They had no money to print literature, and the monsoon weather of Hong Kong prevented them from having the kind of open-air revival that had brought so much success to Mormonism in the American Midwest. Dispirited by the bad weather, made ill by the unusual food, and running out of funds, the three men quickly gave up in under 2 months. Having never found a way to actually reach the Chinese mainland, the three would return home, telling the Mormon authorities in Utah that China was worth avoiding at all costs. The failure of the three men was perhaps unsurprising. Their arrival in the 1850s coincided with the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest wars in all of human history. Much like the Mormons, the Taiping were a Messianic Christian offshoot, led by a man who believed that he had been given a New Testament by Jesus Christ. As a result, I can't help feel that part of the reason that the Mormons had so little interest in Hong Kong in the 1850s is because their little niche in the religious market had already been filled by the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Now, perhaps the LDS Church hierarchy agreed with my assessment, because as far as I can tell, no other Mormons set foot in China until 1910, when a man called Alma Taylor would tour northern China on his way back from a rather successful mission trip to Japan. He would, however, find the Chinese as little interested in Mormonism as when our first Mormon missionaries had arrived in Hong Kong in the 1850s. This was, after all, only about 10 years after the Boxer Rebellion, when the Chinese people had tried to expel all Christians from China. Alma Taylor would suggest to the LDS Church back in Utah that the resources could be better spent elsewhere. Now, there would be an official LDS mission setting up shop in Beijing in 1921, but just as in 1852 and 1910, the mission attracted zero converts and would close before the end of the year. The turmoil of the warlord period and the war against Japan would further discourage Mormon activity in China. But after World War II, the LDS Church would finally open its first permanent mission in Hong Kong in 1949. Plans to expand to the mainland were yet again halted by the declaration of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October of that year, and for the rest of the Mao period, the Mormons concentrated their efforts in Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan, opening a permanent mission in Taipei in 1956. The reform and opening up period represented a wonderful opportunity for the Mormons, and the Church was quick to seize the opportunity that was represented in the thawing of religious attitudes in the years after Mao's death. As early as 1979, the Church would send official representatives to meet in Beijing on a diplomatic goodwill mission. And by the end of that year, the LDS had sent out a Church-sponsored dance troupe on a cultural exchange tour of China. Now, the dance troupe engaged in zero religious activity, but it represented a wonderful opportunity for normal Chinese citizens to watch and interact with Mormons for the very first time. This seems to have went over pretty positively, because it would form the basis of LDS Church-China relations in the coming decades. Unlike, say, American evangelicals, the Mormons would strictly adhere to China's anti-proliferation work, focusing their missionary activity almost exclusively on the diaspora or on Chinese students studying overseas in American universities. Within the Chinese mainland proper, the LDS Church would engage in only educational and cultural activities. For example, Brigham Young University, the leading LDS-affiliated university in America, has had a teacher exchange program in China since 1988, and Mormon charities are very heavily involved in providing relief in China. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, they were even officially thanked by the Chinese government for providing medical aid. The plan, it seems, is to present a non-threatening face to the Chinese government, a government that is hypersensitive to anything that may appear a little bit culty. And it seems to have worked, because the Chinese government has responded pretty positively to the Mormons, with high-ranking officials having met Mormons both in China and elsewhere. The peak of this cultural activity from the Chinese side occurred a couple of years ago, when a school in Utah sent a letter to Xi Jinping, the President of China, and the President of China wrote a letter back. Now, this story received pretty positive coverage in both America and in China, but the thing that was missing in the reporting was why this school in Utah had decided to send a letter to the leader of China in the first place, and why was it that someone in his office had looked at this and went, we should send a letter back. And the answer is the influence of Mormonism in the state of Utah, and that church's relationship with the Communist Party of China. This softly approach of the LDS Church has paid dividends in opening up China to Mormonism. While the LDS Church are not allowed to openly advertise or recruit for Mormonism, Mormon churches and Mormon communities do meet in the big cities like Beijing and Shanghai with the full knowledge of Chinese officials. This puts Mormons in an almost unique category among religions in China. They are not one of the 5 officially recognised religions, but they are not fully prescribed either. The forging out of this grey area for themselves is largely due to the decades of work done by the LDS Church to dampen fears among the communist leadership that, as an American religious organisation, they will be a front for American government infiltration to the country. By and large, the Chinese government appears to believe the Mormons when they say that all they want to do is practice their religion and contribute to society in a constructive way. And LDS documentation in Chinese will often stress the compatibility of Mormon values with traditional Chinese values, like respect for the family and veneration of ancestors. The Mormon Church's focus on cultural exchange and the cultivation of high-ranking Communist Party officials has opened up space for the Church to grow inside mainland China, despite still lacking official legal status. The first expat branch opened up in Beijing in 1986, and today there are dozens of branches in over 20 different cities, although it has to be said some of these branches are very, very small. In 2004, the church opened its first official church or official branch for Chinese citizens. In China, the Mormon Church segregates foreign passport holders from Chinese citizens to try and allay fears by the Chinese government that these could be areas of American government infiltration. This is a policy not unique to the Mormon Church. Most expat churches in China will be foreign passport holding only. However, it has to be said that in my experience that if you are a foreigner and you want to go to a Chinese language, officially sanctioned church, there are usually absolutely no problems. Since 2012, the LDS Church has even operated a Chinese language website, and while the distribution of Mormon literature inside China is illegal, the LDS English language websites remain unblocked for Chinese netizens, so if a Chinese citizen wanted to access the Book of Mormon in English, they could merely do so on their laptop. Currently, it is estimated that there is somewhere in the region of 10,000 Mormons living on the Chinese mainland, with another 73,000 spread across Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau. Most Chinese converts to Mormonism will encounter the faith while studying or working abroad, and then return to China. They will seek out local branches there. The Mormon Church itself follows the anti-conversion and anti-proliferation laws of the Chinese government very, very closely. So if you, as a person, happen to encounter Mormonism somehow in China and decide you want to convert, the Mormon Church will ensure that what you do is buy a plane ticket to Hong Kong, where you can get baptised perfectly legally and then return to your community on the mainland. This, of course, means that converting to Mormonism in China has a high barrier of entry. But what it does mean is that, according to Mormon official statistics, the retention of converts to Mormonism is much higher in China than elsewhere. This is probably because that if you are someone who decides you're going to convert to a religion, are told that you have to buy a plane ticket to Hong Kong, and then you go through with that, you're probably pretty certain that this is the religion for you. The hope in Salt Lake City appears to be that all this will lead to some form of legalization eventually. And I think the announcement of the building of the temple in Shanghai probably suggests that the Mormon Church believes that this will happen sooner rather than later. Now, of course, the building of this temple is currently in limbo, but I don't think, given that the Mormon Church has spent decades cultivating the Chinese government, that they would have just announced it unilaterally. Because I think a unilateral announcement had a high risk of spooking the Chinese Communist Party. As such, I think that the announcement in 2020 of this temple suggests that talks between the CPC and the Mormon Church are ongoing. Now, of course, the benefits of a close relationship with the Communist Party of China and the LDS Church are pretty obvious for the Mormons. If they succeed, they gain access to a new country of over 1 billion people for their faith. But what does an officially atheistical Communist Party get out of maintaining such close ties with a church based in Utah? Well, at a time of heightening tensions between China and the US, Beijing has precious few friends in America. As such, Beijing appears to view people like President Russell M. Neilson, the current leader of the LDS Church, and other high-ranking Mormons as a valuable bridge of friendship and diplomacy between the US and China. For example, Neilson, the president of the LDS Church, has a personal connection with China, having taken part in a training program for Chinese doctors in the 1980s. This work saw him honoured with a degree from Shandong University Medical School in 2015, where he met some of his old students. And it appears to be him who is the main driving force behind the diplomatic mission between China and the Mormon Church in recent decades. The kind of cultural and educational exchange that Neilson has engaged in and is now spearheading was principally designed by the LDS Church as a way to present a friendly face of Mormonism to the Chinese government. However, in the process it seems that the Chinese have also presented a friendly face to the Mormons. As such, the average Mormon and the average Mormon official has a much friendlier attitude toward China than the average American citizen or the average American official in the American government. It should be noted that, despite being a heavily Republican state, the Mormon majority state of Utah has been much slower in passing anti-China legislation and engaging in anti-China rhetoric than other places in the US. And a recent Associated Press report suggests that this might be, by and large, because of the political power the Mormon Church wields within that state. That is to say, well-connected individuals and groups inside Utah have a positive attitude to China, and that is being reflected in Utah state policy and their statements to the US government. Now, an elite FBI report has stated that they are concerned that the LDS Church is becoming a conduit for Chinese propaganda inside America. But it must be said that actual evidence for this is pretty sparse, consisting mostly of the fact that because of cultural, educational and political ties, Mormons and Mormon Church officials tend to be much less willing to swallow State Department anti-China talking points than your average American religious group. There is basically no evidence, as far as I can tell, that the Chinese government is actually pulling the strings in Utah. Instead, what you have is individuals and groups within Utah who have close cultural ties to China and are therefore less likely to engage in the kind of xenophobic behaviour we've seen rising in the US recently. What has happened, however, it seems, is a relationship of mutual development has developed between the Mormon Church and the Chinese government. The Chinese government treads softly on Mormon issues inside China, and in exchange the LDS Church use its political influence within Utah to make sure that the Utah state government treads softly on Chinese issues within that state. The relationship between the Communist Party of China and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is now much closer than the relationship between the Chinese government and the US government. The relationship was initially started by the LDS Church as a way to spread American and Mormon cultural values inside China. But the relationship in recent years has also become an important way and an important conduit for an increasing Chinese cultural exchange inside America. The big question for the LDS Church, of course, is can they ever achieve their official aim of official legal status on the Chinese mainland? From my perspective, I think this is incredibly unlikely. The Chinese state remains very, very suspicious of any religious group with a headquarters outside of China. See their often tested relationship with the Catholic Church, for example. However, Mormonism's unique position in China as a well-behaved, not quite legal but officially tolerated sect, and the increasing value of the LDS is a cultural bridge for China inside America that acts independently of the often hostile American government, means that I think if any religious group can add a sixth name to the official list of recognised religions inside China, it is probably the Mormons. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you like what I do here, think about liking, sharing and subscribing. You can also find links to all my socials, as well as my Substacks and the sources for this video in the box down below. On this channel, I want to try and explain more to a Western audience what life is like here in China, both in the far history and in the present day. So please leave a comment as to any kind of subject that you would be interested in learning more about. So until next time, bye bye.